So good morning to everyone. I will talk on questions related to a book I recently published with a colleague, Silvia Meiezo, by Palgrave Macmillan, on the question of Eurocentrism, racism, and knowledge production and dissemination. Thank you. So I'll try not to go much ahead of time. So this was the kind of work that Mitchell asked me to speak about, and I will give a few practical examples of questions that we address in this book. In our work, we have sought to identify the key aspects that allow for the enduring reproduction of Eurocentrism, despite ample political struggles and epistemological endeavors to contest it. Following Salman Said, we approach Eurocentrism as a project to recenter the West. That is, as a discourse and interpretative paradigm that help us to make sense of the past, the present, and the future by consecrating settler horizons and the exceptionality of the West, its history and identity. Crucial to this endeavor, in our view, is unraveling how the critique to Eurocentrism in knowledge production and dissemination has been accommodated, including in education. And I draw here on the comments that were made to a large news report on the work that we've been carrying out. So two narratives stand out. First, the West is best narrative. This approach unapologetically considers Eurocentrism as a fact and a solution. Europeans would have developed the best forms of civilization, society, and political organization, and therefore their central position in history should be, and I quote, unashamedly accepted. This is supported by the idea that curricula and textbooks need to be particularly selective due to the extension of school programs. What is seen as crucial is that students learn about their Western or European heritage. Any position challenging this approach is accused of conceding to politically correct ideas, unrealistic visions of society, and falling into guilty traps, an argument usually defended in conservative circles, including in academia. It is not always this unambiguous, but it resists attempts to study Eurocentrism by accusing those who do so of historical revisionism and of obliterating the positive contributions of Europe to the world. Second, the Eurocentrism is ethnocentrist narrative. This approach draws on the idea that, and I quote, history is always seen through the eyes of one people, and therefore why should we not tell history from the point of view of the national, the European, or the Western? It is an idea that contains several problematic aspects: the erasing of heterogeneity and the assumption of coherence and consensus in historical narratives, the implicitly equal power attributed to each narrative to impose itself more widely, the depoliticization of the effects of this imposition, and the associated neutralization of attempts of political change, generally accusing critics of catering for the particularistic agendas of racialized populations. It is grounded in the assumptions that racism is a universal phenomenon, history is never impartial, and ideology no longer matters. This approach, which downgrades Eurocentrism to a mere ethnocentrism, a situated perspective by which each people tells its own history, and that consecrates the winner's perspective, is most often adopted in progressive circles that resist considering white privilege. It implies that Eurocentrism can be counteracted by any other centrism, such as Afrocentrism, as racism could be mirrored by reverse racism, and I'm quoting Salman Said here. This framework glosses over the fact that there has not been an opening to those different approaches in our universities and schools across Europe. In addition, this framing of the problem has most often led to depoliticized solutions, such as the inclusion of content, without an appreciation of the cultural practices, wider prescriptive statements, as analyzed by Sylvia Winter, and the narrative formulas, as worked by Michel Rovtroyot, which continue to recenter Europe and the West. This has been mostly evident in regards to history and education and its evasion of race as power, central themes in the books we published. Ample literature has shown how following the 1960s calls by the Black movement in the US, as well as by indigenous populations, to reorganize the system of knowledge, have been met with quick institutional reaction to contain them, as analyzed by Angela Davis, and led to eventual concessions, such as the addition of appendices to history, mentioning a few elements of the history and culture of oppressed groups in a curriculum and textbooks that remained essentially white and Eurocentric. For instance, although a few pages have been included in North American textbooks dedicated to heroes sanitized a posteriori, such as Martin Luther King or Rosa Parks, these have been mostly presented as individuals capable of suddenly and single-handedly changing an entire system of racial oppression, exploitation, and discrimination. As noted by Gloria Lasson-Billings, thus Rosa Parks is reduced to a tired seamstress instead of a long-time participant in social justice endeavors, as evident. Sorry, I thought I was going, because I speak too quickly, I thought you were just calming me down. As evidenced by her work at Highlander Folk School to prepare for confrontation with segregationist ideology. Or Martin Luther King. Oh, sorry. Or Martin Luther King Jr. becomes a sanitized folk hero who enjoyed the support of good Americans, rather than a disdained scholar and activist whose vision extended to social justice causes through the world and challenged USA on issues of economic injustice and aggression in Southeast Asia. This compensatory approach, so it was end of quote, this compensatory approach to the teaching of history rewrites the nation by adding another, whilst maintaining intact the master script. Such positivist endeavor not only rules out political conflict over meaning and historical facts, but most significantly takes absences as naive omissions which would be corrected once the appropriate knowledge is available. By doing so, this approach does not consider the wider tropes which consecrate white privilege or validate the need for the reconstruction of knowledge. Rather, we think it's crucial to engage with how selective silences and divisibilities are actively manufactured in the making of sources, in the creation of archives, through the narrator's work, and in the processes of canonization, as brilliantly analyzed in the recently republished account by Michel Rovtre-Trouillot, Silencing the Past, on the formulas of erasure and trivialization of the revolution of IT. In order to illustrate this point further, let us consider the case of the London Sugar and Slavery Gallery at the Museum of London Docklands, which speaks of how the silences persist despite more knowledge and information. The result of dialogue between academics, engaged intellectuals, and museum professionals, it was opened followed 2007 commemorations of the anniversary of the abolition of the Slave Trade Act by the British Parliament. Despite some problematic issues, namely that the question of contemporary institutional racism is not sufficiently addressed, it is a key initiative linking the history of colonialism and slavery, enslavement, and racism in Europe. The exhibition was crucial to bring about the history of enslaved populations in their struggles, to deconstruct widely circulated racist representations and narratives, as well as to highlight historic anti-racist movements and initiatives. Yet, the exhibition gallery is part of a broader museum infrastructure that displays, and I quote, the port and river collection, from Roman settlement to the development of Canary Wharf, revealing the long history of the capital as a port through stories of trade, migration, and commerce, end of quote. The critical narrative pursued in the gallery on enslavement contrasts sharply with, and is neutralized by, the broader account of British imperialism that immediately precedes it, so just before this room that you can see there. For instance, the panel New Horizons of the museum reads, new maps of the world, in circulation during the 15th century, encouraged exploration. In 1492, the Italian Cristoforo Colombo sailed from Cadiz across to the Atlantic Ocean to the West Indies. Then, in 1497, the Portuguese adventurer Vasco da Gama discovered the route to India by sea. This gave Portugal a monopoly of the valuable spice trade. End of quote. This example, which deploys commonly accepted and circulated notions of exploration and adventure, depoliticizes interpretations of the post-colonial and the colonial, and it is revealing of the resistance to challenging white privilege. You may be included, but you will not disrupt. This is one of the many instances that points to how critiques to Eurocentrism and racism are being neutralized in many European contexts. Concessions to the inclusion of other histories may be granted as far as they do not clash with the Eurocentric master narrative. In fact, they often entail the reassertion of the centrality of the West and Europe. At the University of Coimbra, where I work, about 2 years ago, a group of students launched a campaign denouncing the racist, sexist, and homophobic treatment they were subjected to by colleagues and lecturers. The news was first disseminated in the Brazilian media, as most of the students putting forward the denunciations were visiting students from Brazil. Besides the campaign in the social media, a small demonstration took place in 2014, and an open letter to the university was sent calling for the opening of an inquiry. The university resisted to accept their denunciations and failed to launch the inquiry. It actually helped to blame the victims by constructing the students who had been harassed as suspects, that is, publicly stating that these students raised suspicion and they acted irresponsibly by providing accounts with great imprecisions. We are witnessing at the moment a context of increasing internationalization of higher education in which universities are competing for external funds and the fear of losing its competitive status in recruiting overseas students. Students from Brazil are meanwhile required to pay fees that are 7 times higher than their national peers, despite all the historical connections between the two countries that have been invoked. I'm okay with time? Yet, rather than protecting its students from discrimination in this context of internationalization, the university reacted by launching and circulating a campaign consisting of a collection of videos with testimonies by other Brazilian students showing how happy and integrated they felt in Coimbra. This moment helped the university to reassert its position as center, for which, as is often the case in Portugal, its history was called for. And I quote the declaration that was issued by the university following the public denunciations by students. The secular creative coexistence between students from many backgrounds is one of the strongest hallmarks of the University of Coimbra. Freedom, the debate of ideas, and the sharing of different points of view are assets that as university we must cherish. The University of Coimbra is naturally not immune to the problems of prejudice and stereotypes of the society in which it operates. In a universe of over 30,000 people, there are always disagreements and occasional arguments caused by a variety of reasons, whether between Portuguese and citizens of other countries, whether involving people of various nationalities. None of these can be confused with the existence of a xenophobic environment at the University of Coimbra, end of quote. The students eventually flew back to Brazil without seeing an inquiry opened. I would like to call attention to 2 aspects. First, the Eurocentric concept of racism, which is invoked, that is within the prejudice and stereotypes paradigm, which template was built on Nazism and the Holocaust, not allowing to discuss the routine forms of rationalized governance that were inherited from colonialism, that is, institutional racism. This in itself preempted the need for a discussion on how the university promotes Eurocentric canons of knowledge. Second, the mobilization of history, this calling of the past to legitimate the racist present, as argued by Michel Rouve-Trouillot. This can be seen more widely across Europe, as there has been a revival of the imaginary of the so-called discoveries, empire, and expansion, ranging from historiography to schooling and advertisement, recent board games, touristic routes, and sites. These kind of concerns have been at the heart of the production of the book Eurocentrism, Racism and Knowledge, Debates on History and Power in Europe and the Americas. In conceiving of Eurocentrism as a paradigm for an interpretation of reality, we insisted on the need to bring the relation between knowledge and power to the center of disputes on national identity, cultural diversity, and the validation of other narratives. This entailed to interrogate the history of Europe and the Americas, not only as being written without considering racism and, colonialism and racial enslavement, but also as interpreting these processes as dark chapters in the triumphal development of modernity. The collection of chapters took as a starting point the critical inquiry of taken for granted assumptions underlying interpretations of the boundaries of the colonial, the national, Europe, and Europeanness. In particular, the book engages with the construction of what Sylvia Wynter called Euro-immigrant nation in several American contexts and the presumed homogeneity of the nation in Europe, achieved and enforced through violence and the purging of difference as proposed by David Goldberg. Both these notions consecrate the privilege of white Europeans and their descendants, albeit unwritten in historical accounts due to a depoliticizing approach. Accordingly, several chapters in the collection interrogate the ways in which different patterns of silencing articulate with and accommodate recognition and representation through formulas of knowledge production, consolidation and consumption that trivialize existing power arrangements and enduring political struggles. As a whole, they point to the consequences of unveiling local and regional interconnected histories, opening up attention not only with other histories, but also with the specific attempts within Eurocentric thought to continually reshape the world in racially hierarchical terms and to recenter the West. The book is thus an attempt to engage directly with these ideas on Eurocentrism, considering how they are permeated by race and the narrative formulas for accommodating the critique. This extends beyond the concern with the absence of representations of diversity or with the misrepresentation of the other to focus on the question of power. Whilst not implying that other perspectives and historiographies are not necessary, we argue that any alternative to hegemonic narratives needs to be understood within its struggle for political legitimacy, scientific validity, and educational relevance. Thank you.